Okay, so right now as you're listening to this, um, there's this incredible system working away inside you. I mean, it's absolutely essential, and it's your respiratory system. And that's what we're diving into today.
And we've got like this really solid study guide to help us break it all down.
Yeah, it's comprehensive for
Yeah.
sure. So the goal is to, get past that basic level of just knowing, okay, I breathe, air goes in, air goes out.
Right, exactly. We want to like really get you to understand how elegant the system is and how efficient.
Yeah,
Like it's working constantly every second to keep you alive.
and it really is so much more than just like oxygen in and carbon dioxide out.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The guide, it highlights, all these other functions. Like, think about it. It warms the air, it moistens it, it filters out all that, junk we're breathing in.
It's like this built-in air purifier, really.
It is. It even, like, plays a role in keeping our pH balanced, which is something you don't really think about.
Right.
And then, of course, there's how we speak, how we sing, all thanks to the respiratory system.
Hmm.
And even surprisingly, our sense of smell is tied into it. But yeah, the main event is that gas exchange.
Definitely. And what's really cool here is how it's a team effort.
Yeah.
So the guide, it lays out how this gas exchange actually involves two interconnected systems. You've got the respiratory system itself, which does the ventilation part, so, the breathing in and out, the physical part.
Right.
And it also handles what we call external respiration. That's the swapping of those gases, the oxygen and the CO2, between your lungs and your bloodstream.
Okay.
But then you've got the circulatory system, your blood vessels and heart, which pick up those gases and transport them throughout your body.
Oh, okay.
And that's where internal respiration comes in. So, the exchange between the blood and your tissues, the individual cells that need that oxygen.
Okay, so like a relay race.
It is, yeah, a really well coordinated one.
All right, so let's trace the path of the air itself,
Yeah.
right? Where does this journey begin?
Well, it starts in what's called the conducting zone.
Okay.
Think of it as, the network of highways leading to those gas exchange terminals.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so it begins with the nasal cavity, right?
Right.
Then it moves down through the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and finally it branches out into this intricate bronchial tree.
It does get pretty complex there.
It does, yeah.
One thing that jumped out at me in the guide was the presence of, MALT, that mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue,
Oh, yeah.
lining this whole conducting zone. And it made me think, well, it makes sense, right? Because this whole system, it's like the body's direct point of contact with the outside world.
That's right, yeah. So that frontline defense.
Yeah, everything we inhale.
Yeah.
Okay, so the nose and nasal cavity, I mean, it's so much more than just a hole in your face.
Right. It really is like a multitasker.
It is.
Yeah, you mentioned air passage, but it also warms that incoming air. It moistens it, filters out all those, bigger particles thanks to those, little hairs called vibrissae
Yeah.
that are in the vestibule. And then you've got, it even contributes to the resonance of our speech and, of course, our sense of smell
Right.
because of the olfactory epithelium.
And that's the upper part of the nasal cavity.
That's right, the superior region, yeah.
And I always find it so interesting, like the architecture in there, you know? The conchae, the meatuses, these like bony swirls and these channels, it's amazing.
It is. It's like they increase the surface area so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
And then it creates this turbulence in the airflow. And I think that really helps to maximize the warming, the moistening, and that filtering.
Makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Plus, most of the nasal cavity is lined with this respiratory epithelium.
Right.
This, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with all that mucus.
Yeah. So imagine like a constantly moving, sticky carpet.
Yeah.
That's kind of the essence of this ciliated epithelium.
So the cilia, they're like tiny little oars.
They are, yeah.
Yeah.
Just constantly sweeping away debris, keeping things clean, all the way down to your lungs.
Wow. And the study guide, it points out those connections to the paranasal sinuses and the lacrimal sac.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So suddenly, sinus headaches and watery eyes, it's like, oh, okay, I see.
No, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you think about, how the design of the nasal cavity is just perfectly optimized to, deal with the environment.
Right.
Now, moving down, we encounter the pharynx.
Or the throat.
Right, the throat. And the guide divides it up into three parts.
Okay.
You've got the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. And it's really interesting how the lining of this passageway changes as we move down.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so each type of tissue reflects like what's going on in that particular area.
Okay. So tell me about those three regions.
Okay, so you've got the nasopharynx kind of tucked away behind the nasal cavity,
Mm-hmm.
and it's got the same pseudostratified epithelium we were talking about.
Okay.
It houses those pharyngeal tonsils, the adenoids,
Right.
and the openings of those auditory tubes, the ones that connect to your ears.
Okay.
And then we move down to the oropharynx, which is, the part you can see when you open your mouth.
Right.
And suddenly the lining changes.
Right.
It becomes the stratified, squamous epithelium, tougher stuff,
Okay, tougher for a reason.
It's got to handle all that abrasion from chewing and swallowing.
Right.
And that's where those other tonsils are, the lingual and palatine ones.
Okay.
And finally, you've got the laryngopharynx,
Mm-hmm.
also lined with stratified squamous. And this is like the fork in the road.
Oh, yeah.
Of our...
Air and food.
Exactly.
Right. Mm.
The airway diverts to the trachea, and the food path continues down to the esophagus. It's like, talk about crucial infrastructure, right?
That is.
Yeah.
And then we get to the larynx.
The voice box.
Right, the voice box.
Sitting right there below the pharynx,
Yeah.
connected to the trachea.
Yeah.
And its main job is to maintain that open airway, but it's also, it controls air and food, and of course, it's where we produce our voice.
That is impressive.
It is, yeah. And it's got these 9 cartilages, the thyroid cartilage, that's your Adam's apple.
Okay.
And then you've got the cricoid cartilage, really prominent ones.
Right.
And then there's the epiglottis.
Oh, yes.
That little flap that snaps shut over the trachea when you swallow,
Yeah.
Keeps the food from going down the wrong pipe.
Which you don't really think about until, something goes wrong.
Right, exactly.
And then you've got the vocal cords themselves. And the guide makes this distinction between, true and false vocal cords.
Right, yeah.
So it's the true ones that actually vibrate to make the sound.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
There are these delicate folds of mucous membrane stretched across the larynx, and when you force air past them, they vibrate. That's how we create sound.
Wow.
The false vocal cords, or the vestibular folds, they don't actually make the sound, but they protect the true ones.
Okay.
And just like the pharynx, the larynx, it changes its lining as you go down.
Okay.
So you start with that sturdy stratified squamous at the top, and then it transitions into pseudostratified ciliated epithelium as you move down.
Right.
Keeps that mucus flowing.
The mucociliary escalator we were talking about.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so next up on our little tour of the airways is the trachea.
Or the windpipe.
The windpipe.
Yeah.
So it sits there in front of the esophagus, right, down in the mediastinum, and it goes from the larynx all the way down to where it splits into the 2 main bronchi.
Right.
But the real defining feature here, I think, has to be those C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage.
They're pretty distinctive, yeah.
Yeah, there are 16 to 20 of them?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
And they're C-shaped, with the open side facing the esophagus.
Right.
The guide makes a point of mentioning that. Why that shape? Why not a full circle?
That's a great question. It's all about design, really.
Okay.
So the esophagus, it sits right behind the trachea, right?
Right.
And when you swallow, especially a big chunk of food, the esophagus needs to expand.
Oh, okay.
And if those cartilage rings were complete circles, they would get in the way.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the C shape allows for that flexibility. Cool. And just like those upper airways, the trachea is lined with, that pseudostratified ciliated mucosa.
Yeah.
Goblet cells pumping out the mucus, cilia beating away.
Yeah, that mucociliary escalator hard at work.
Right.
And then under that, you've got the submucosa, which also helps make mucus. And the whole thing's wrapped up in this outer layer of connective tissue, the adventitia.
Okay. So the air is warm, it's moist, it's been filtered. Now it hits the bronchial tree.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really branchy.
It does.
Literally like the roots of a tree spreading through the lungs.
Yeah.
So you start with the primary bronchi.
Right.
And they split into the secondary bronchi, or lobar bronchi.
Okay.
3 on the right to go to those 3 lobes of the right lung.
Right.
And then 2 on the left for the left lung's 2 lobes.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then it keeps branching. Tertiary bronchi, or segmental bronchi. And then finally, the smallest ones, the bronchioles.
Okay.
And the guide, it highlights this really important point here.
Yeah.
The conducting zone, it officially ends at the bronchioles.
Oh, okay.
Because that's where we switch over to the respiratory zone, where the actual gas exchange happens.
Right.
But even within the conducting zone, there are some pretty significant changes happening as those airways get smaller.
Like that.
Well, the cartilage You know, it starts out as those rigid C-shaped rings in the trachea, but as you move down into the smaller bronchi, it changes into these irregular plates.
Okay.
And then in the bronchioles, it disappears completely.
No more cartilage.
Nope. And the epithelium lining, it changes too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it goes from that tall, columnar shape to more of a cuboidal shape. And finally, it becomes this really thin squamous lining in the respiratory zone.
Okay.
And then, maybe the most important change is the smooth muscle.
Okay, so the smooth muscle increases as the airways get smaller.
It does, yeah. And that allows for bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation, which is how we control the diameter of those airways.
So like opening and closing to adjust the airflow.
Exactly, yeah.
Makes sense. So we've reached the end of the conducting zone.
We have, yeah.
What happens now?
Now we're entering the respiratory zone, the real engine room of breathing.
Okay.
This is where gas exchange happens.
Okay.
So this zone, it includes the respiratory bronchioles, which actually have a few alveoli budding off their walls.
Okay.
And then the alveolar ducts, and finally the alveolar sacs.
And those are the clusters of individual alveoli, right?
Exactly.
Those tiny air sacs.
Yeah, and the structure of the alveoli, it's perfectly designed for this rapid exchange.
Tell me about it.
Okay, so you've got type I alveolar cells, which are simple squamous epithelium, incredibly thin.
So that maximizes the surface area.
Exactly. And it minimizes the distance that the oxygen and CO2 have to diffuse.
Makes sense.
Then you've got the type 2 cells.
Yeah.
They're a bit more cuboidal, and they secrete surfactant.
Oh, yeah, surfactant. That's super important, right?
It is.
Prevents those alveoli from collapsing.
Yeah, like tiny little balloons.
Right.
You don't want them deflating.
Exactly. And then we've got those alveolar macrophages, the dust cells, keeping things clean.
Right.
Immune system's cleanup crew.
Right there at the gas exchange surface.
And the guide also mentioned these alveolar pores, tiny little holes that connect the alveoli. What are those for?
Well, those pores, they help to equalize pressure between the alveoli. So if, some of the smaller airways get blocked, which can happen, those pores provide an alternate route for air to flow.
Oh, okay.
So it keeps those alveoli inflated. And surrounding all this delicate structure, you've got elastic fibers.
Right.
They're vital for allowing the lungs to expand and recoil with each breath.
Okay. And all of this microscopic machinery, it leads to the respiratory membrane.
Right.
That thin barrier where the gas exchange actually takes place.
Yeah, incredibly thin.
The guide highlights how thin.
Yeah.
You've got the wall of the alveolus, the wall of the capillary, and their fused basement membranes.
It's like a microscopic interface designed for speed.
It has to be.
It does, yeah.
Now, stepping back a bit, we've got the lungs themselves.
The main organs.
Yeah, 2 of them.
Right lung's a bit bigger, 3 lobes.
Okay.
Left lung's got 2 lobes, gonna make room for the heart.
Right, right.
And they're enclosed in the thoracic cavity, surrounded by those pleural membranes. The visceral pleura, that's stuck right to the lungs, and then the parietal pleura lining the chest wall.
Okay.
And between them, you've got the pleural cavity with a bit of pleural fluid in there.
Right.
It might seem like a small detail, but the guide really emphasizes how crucial this fluid is.
What does it do?
Well, for one, it's a lubricant.
Okay.
So it reduces friction as the lungs move with each breath.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, it helps create this pressure gradient.
A pressure gradient.
Yeah, so the pressure inside the pleural cavity, we call it intrapleural pressure. It's usually about 4 mmHg lower than the pressure inside the alveoli, the intrapulmonary pressure.
Okay, so it's like a slight suction.
Exactly. It pulls the lungs outward, keeps them from collapsing.
Wow.
And the fluid also kind of compartmentalizes the lungs.
Okay.
So if one gets injured, the other can hopefully keep working.
That's good.
Yeah.
The guide even mentions pleural effusion,
Right.
where fluid builds up in that cavity.
Yeah, it can happen with infection or heart failure.
Shows how important that balance is.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's move on to the mechanics of breathing.
The ventilation.
Right, ventilation. How does it actually work?
Well, it's all driven by changes in pressure.
Okay.
And the guide explains this really well using Boyle's law.
Boyle's law.
Yeah, it basically says that as the volume of a container increases, the pressure inside decreases.
Okay.
And vice versa.
So how does that apply to our lungs?
Well, think about inspiration, breathing in. That's an active process. It requires muscles to contract.
Okay.
So you've got the diaphragm, that big dome-shaped muscle at the bottom of your chest.
Right.
It contracts and flattens, which makes the chest cavity bigger vertically.
Okay.
And then you've got the external intercostal muscles between your ribs. They contract and lift the rib cage up and out. which expands the chest sideways and front to back.
So the chest cavity gets bigger in all directions.
Exactly. And for really deep breaths, you can even use accessory muscles, like the scales, sternocleidomastoid, pectoralis minor.
Okay.
So the sequence goes like this. The muscles contract.
Okay.
Thoracic cavity gets bigger. The lungs expand to fill that space. The pressure inside the lungs, that intrapulmonary pressure, it drops a bit below atmospheric pressure and air rushes in.
Until the pressure equalizes.
Exactly. Now, expiration, breathing out, that's usually passive.
Passive.
Yeah. Those muscles we were talking about, the diaphragm and external intercostals, they just relax.
Okay.
The lungs, they naturally recoil. The chest wall does too. So thoracic volume decreases, the lungs shrink back, intrapulmonary pressure rises above atmospheric pressure, and air flows out.
Simple as that.
It is, yeah. But for forced expiration, like if you're exercising hard or singing,
Right.
you use other muscles, the abdominal muscles, the internal intercostals. They help push the air out more forcefully.
Okay. So those pressures, they're really important to understand.
They are, yeah. So you've got atmospheric pressure, which is our baseline, about 760 millimillichi at sea level. Intrapulmonary pressure, the pressure in your lungs, it goes up and down with each breath, but ultimately balances out with atmospheric pressure.
Right.
But it's that intrapleural pressure, the pressure in that cavity around the lungs, it's always a bit lower.
Right.
And that's what keeps your lungs inflated.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, there are a few things that can affect how easily we breathe.
Yeah, like what?
Well, you've got airway resistance,
Okay.
anything that blocks airflow, mucus, constricted airways.
Right.
Then there's alveolar surface tension.
Which surfactant helps with, right?
Exactly. Makes those alveoli expand easier.
Okay.
And then there's lung compliance.
Lung compliance.
Yeah, how stretchy your lungs are. If they're too stiff or too loose, it can make breathing difficult.
Okay.
The guide also talks about different lung volumes. So you've got tidal volume, which is just the air you breathe in and out normally.
Like everyday breathing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Then you've got inspiratory reserve volume. That's the extra air you can inhale forcefully. Expiratory reserve volume, the extra air you can force out, and residual volume. That's the air that always stays in your lungs.
Even after you exhale as much as you can.
Even then, yeah.
Why is that important?
Well, it keeps those alveoli from collapsing completely.
Oh, okay.
So your lungs are always ready for the next breath.
Makes sense.
And then there's dead space.
Dead space.
Yeah, it's air that fills the airways but doesn't reach the alveoli.
So it doesn't participate in gas exchange?
Nope. About 1 ml per pound of body weight.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about the actual movement of gases now.
Yeah, getting into the gas laws.
Right. So Dalton's law, it says that the total pressure of a gas mixture is just the sum of the individual pressures of each gas.
Right. Each gas has its own push, its partial pressure.
And that's what drives their movement, right?
Exactly. The higher the partial pressure, the more of that gas will want to move into a liquid.
Okay, so that brings us to Henry's law, which explains how gases dissolve in liquids.
Right. So the amount of gas that dissolves depends on its partial pressure and its solubility in that liquid.
So some gas dissolve better than others.
They do, yeah. And that's why CO2 is so much more soluble in blood than oxygen, which is more soluble than nitrogen.
Okay, so that difference is important for gas exchange.
Absolutely. It's all about efficiency.
Okay, so let's talk about external respiration, that gas exchange happening between the air in our lungs and our blood.
Right, at the alveoli.
So the guide says oxygen, which has a high partial pressure in the alveoli, moves into the blood where its partial pressure is lower.
Exactly. It follows that gradient.
And CO2 does the opposite.
Right. It moves from the blood, where it's higher, into the alveoli, where it's lower.
And that's how we get rid of it.
Yep, we exhale it.
And this all happens really fast, right?
It does, yeah. Usually only takes about a quarter of a second.
Wow, that's quick.
It has to be, especially when we're active and our blood flow increases.
Okay, so what about internal respiration? That's the gas exchange of the tissues, right?
Yeah. Right. At the cellular level.
And the pressure gradients are reversed here, right?
They are, yeah. So oxygen, it moves from the blood, where it's higher, into the tissues, where it's lower.
Because the cells are using it up.
Exactly, for cellular respiration.
And CO2 moves from the tissues into the blood.
Right, because it's being produced as a waste product.
Okay, so the gases are exchanged, now they have to be transported.
Right. So oxygen, most of it, about 98.5%, it binds to hemoglobin.
That's the protein in our red blood cells.
Exactly.
Okay, and it's a reversible binding, right?
It is, yeah.
It needs to attach in the lungs and detach in the tissues.
Exactly, like a little delivery truck.
Right, and the guide mentions several things that affect this binding.
It does, yeah. So a lower pH, which means a more acidic environment, like you find in active tissues, it weakens the bond between oxygen and hemoglobin.
So oxygen is released more easily where it's needed.
Exactly. That's called the Bohr effect.
The Bohr effect.
Yeah. A higher temperature, also common in active tissues, has the same effect.
So it promotes oxygen unloading.
It does, yeah. And a higher CO2 concentration directly weakens the bond, too.
Okay.
And then there's BPG.
What's that?
It's a molecule, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, red blood cells make it. And more BPG means less oxygen bound to hemoglobin.
Okay.
So in the lungs, where the pH is higher, the temperature is cooler, and CO2 is lower, oxygen binds easily to hemoglobin.
Right.
But in the tissues, the opposite is true. So oxygen is released.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is, yeah. It's like hemoglobin has sensors.
Right. It knows where to deliver the oxygen.
Exactly. Now, what about CO2 transport? The guide mentions 3 main ways.
Yeah. Bicarbonate ions bound to hemoglobin and dissolved in plasma.
Right. So bicarbonate, that's the main way, about 70%.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, inside red blood cells, CO2 combines with water.
Okay.
And there's this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, that speeds up the reaction.
Mm.
They form carbonic acid, which quickly breaks down into bicarbonate ions, HCO3, and hydrogen ions, H plus I. And then the bicarbonate ions, they move out of the red blood cells into the plasma.
Die.
And the hydrogen ions, they get buffered by hemoglobin, so they don't mess up the pH too much.
So this system, it not only transports CO2, but also helps regulate pH.
Exactly. It's a 2-for-1.
Wow.
About 20% of CO2 binds directly to hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin.
Okay.
And the rest, about 7 to 10%, just dissolves in the plasma.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach to getting rid of CO2.
It is, yeah. Very efficient.
So how does our body actually control all of this? I mean, we don't have to think about breathing.
Right. It's all thanks to the brainstem.
A brainstem.
Yeah, specifically the medulla oblongata. It's got the ventral respiratory group, which is like the pacemaker for breathing.
Okay.
And the pons, which smooths out the transitions between inhalation and exhalation.
So we have a nice, regular breathing pattern.
Exactly.
But our breathing rate and depth, they change all the time.
They do, yeah.
So how does that happen?
Well, the guide mentions several factors. The most important one is CO2 levels in the blood.
CO2.
Yeah, when CO2 levels rise, it makes the blood more acidic.
Okay.
And there are these chemoreceptors in the brainstem and in the major arteries that detect this change.
Okay.
And they send signals to the respiratory centers telling them to increase breathing rate and depth.
To get rid of that extra CO2.
Exactly. And changes in blood pH that aren't related to CO2 can also affect breathing.
Okay.
And then there are stretch receptors in the lungs that prevent overinflation.
So we don't pop like a balloon.
Right. And of course, we have voluntary control over our breathing too.
Right. From the cerebral cortex.
Yeah, we can hold our breath or take a deep breath.
Makes sense.
And our emotions can affect breathing too.
Oh, yeah, like when you're anxious and you breathe faster.
Exactly. The hypothalamus is involved there.
So it's all connected.
It is, yeah. A big feedback loop.
So the brainstem sends signals to the muscles, they contract, the chest cavity changes volume, pressure gradients are created, air moves in and out, and it's all constantly adjusting based on our needs.
Exactly. A beautifully orchestrated system.
It is.
Now, the guide also talks about what can go wrong with this system.
Right, some of the disorders.
Yeah, like hypoxia, which is when your tissues don't get enough oxygen.
Okay.
There are different types. Anemic hypoxia, that's when you don't have enough red blood cells or hemoglobin.
Good.
Ischemic hypoxia, that's when blood flow is impaired.
Okay.
Histotoxic hypoxia, that's when the cells can't use the oxygen, even if it's there.
Okay.
And carbon monoxide poisoning, that's when carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin instead of oxygen.
Oh, wow, that's scary.
It is, yeah. It shows how important that oxygen transport system is.
Definitely. The guide also talks about hyperventilation.
Right, when you breathe too fast and deep.
Yeah, and you lose too much CO2.
Exactly. And that can actually constrict the blood vessels in your brain, which can make you dizzy or even faint. And there's COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.